Seattle, early 1990s, a city that gave the world a sound and then swallowed most of the people who created it. Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, Andrew Wood, Kristen Pfaff. The brightest lights of a generation extinguished, one, by the same darkness that fueled their genius. None of them survived it. And then there was Mark Lanegan. He walked the same streets, breathed the same air, shared needles, stages, and motel rooms with the ones who didn't make it. He had every reason to be another name on that list. He isn't. This is the story of the man who sang backwards and wept and lived to tell it. Act 1. A Delinquent's Childhood. He was born in November 1964 with the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, as if the world was already trying to take him before he even arrived. Ellensburg, Washington, the wrong side of the Cascade Mountains. A small, rural, culturally isolated town where the radio only played country music and nobody had even heard of Jimi Hendrix, born just 90 miles away in Seattle. His family came from coal miners, lumberjacks, smugglers, and convicts. Scots, Irish, Appalachian dirt. Hard people from hard places. His mother, Floy, was a demon. She had watched her own father get murdered on the front lawn when she was 6, raised among men in logging camps. She became, in his father's words, a work of art, not in a good way. From the age of 7, she forced him to go door to door in the neighborhood looking for work. "You're going to have to earn any money around here. I'm not giving you an allowance. That's for spoiled kids, and you're already spoiled enough." He was 8 years old when he fell through the ice of a frozen canal, broke his femur, and nearly drowned. Suspended in freezing water for over an hour, one leg useless, his dog barking helplessly on the bank above him, until a neighbor waded in and pulled him out with a rope. They put a metal bolt in his knee, full body cast, 2 months in the hospital. When he came home, immobile, helpless, practically mummified in plaster from chest to foot, his mother dumped a cardboard box full of hardcover books on his head, in a fit of rage. When he was older, she tried to push him down an escalator. She forced him to pick tomatoes all summer alongside Mexican immigrant workers under the brutal Washington sun, without gloves, while she played cards and drank beer in an air-conditioned house nearby. His hands burned and blistered from the acid of the fruit. He earned maybe $10 a day, money she refused to let his employer pay him directly. When she drank, the cruelty shifted shape. Instead of cold attacks, she'd smile, laugh, turn her children into the punchline of every joke for whatever company was around. Public humiliation as entertainment. Once, she heard him singing softly along to a song on the radio and laughed in his face. "Jesus, don't they teach you kids to sing in school?" She worked as a university professor of early childhood education. "During my entire childhood, my mother was a sick, totally detestable witch. Now I was a grown man, and the last person whose shit I would put up with was her." His father, Dale, was the opposite. A man of few words and deep, silent sadness, but genuinely warm, empathetic, good-hearted. A carpenter, a teacher, a gambler and a drinker, yes, but a good man. When his parents divorced, Mark chose his father without hesitation. And from that moment, no rules, no curfew, no walls. He was free. And that freedom was both the best and the worst thing that ever happened to him. By 12, he was a compulsive gambler, a thief, an alcoholic in training. He stole chocolate bars and sold them to classmates. He rigged punch boards. He picked pockets in the locker room every single day and was never once caught. Then one day, in the only record store in Ellensburg, he saw a shirtless man on the cover of Cream magazine. Who is that? That, my friend, is Iggy Pop. The store owner put on the Sex Pistols, then the Ramones, the Damned, Bowie, Velvet Underground. Mark Lanegan was changed forever. He traded every comic book he owned for records and listened to them alone, obsessively, for years. Music wasn't a career plan. It wasn't even a dream yet. It was just the first thing in his life that felt true. Act 2. The Last Game. Baseball was the one thing in his life that made sense. Not just a sport, an escape. From his mother, from Ellensburg, from himself. He played every day until it was too dark to see the ball, and he was genuinely good. His senior year, he was pitching better than ever, batting over 200 yards, throwing heat, striking batters out with a controlled aggression that scared people. College recruiters had started showing up to games. For the first time in his life, there was a way out. Then a teacher he'd failed the semester before cut a deal with his coach. Come to class an hour early every morning, redo the coursework, and you keep playing. He showed up. The teacher looked him dead in the eye and told him she hadn't agreed to help him. She'd agreed to make his life impossible. She buried him in homework, made every condition unachievable. She could have been his mother. He handed his uniform back to his coach that same afternoon, neatly folded. His coach looked like he was going to cry. "Sorry, coach. The cards are on the table. She never intended for me to succeed." He walked away from baseball forever. The one legitimate way out was gone. And without that structure, without that purpose, everything else rushed in to fill the space. He spent his court-ordered year of sobriety selling and using marijuana and acid, eating blotter before school every morning, attending group sessions high, nodding along while the counselor asked if everyone was clean and sober today. He was never tested. Then one night he took too much acid, a devastating bad trip. His friends had to roll him in a carpet just to keep him still. The next morning, he lit a joint to calm his nerves and went straight back inside the trip. The flashback hit without warning. The same terror, the same darkness, the same place his mind had been trying to escape the night before. And from that day forward, every time he tried to smoke, the portal opened again. Instantly, unavoidably. Marijuana, his companion since he was 13, had become a direct door to the worst place he knew. Without it, only one thing was left. The alcohol took over completely. He was already known as the town drunk before he could legally drink. Full beard at 18, blacking out in bars, waking up in jail with his face stuck to a pillow soaked in his own blood. He'd ride his motorcycle drunk at over 140 kilometers an hour through the night, ending up in some roadside motel, stumbling to the front desk asking what time it was, what day it was, what city it was. He tried to stop. Spent a year in agony trying to get through a single Friday night sober. He'd make it to Friday, then break. Drink for 24 straight hours, no sleep. Then spend 48 hours delirious, lying on his back with a rotary phone on his chest, convinced he was about to die. The cycle was unbearable. The price was so high, mentally, physically, that he began to contemplate suicide. If life was going to be like this, he'd be better off dead. He was planning to leave for Las Vegas when a tractor crushed both his legs in an industrial accident. Bedridden, in agony, furious, he was never going to escape Ellensburg alive. Until a kid named Van Connor, who he'd first seen as a small boy smiling at him from an inflatable pool in his front yard, ended up in detention with him during his last year of high school. In a town of 8,000 people, it took 6 years for them to really meet. That meeting would change everything. Act 3. Screaming Trees. He never planned on being a singer. Van Connor was the first person he'd ever met in Ellensburg who liked the same music. They'd smoke weed, listen to records, laugh. Two outsiders in a town full of people they despised. When Mark got sober, Van showed up again. He needed work. Van's father, Gary Connor, a former school principal turned video store owner, hired him on the spot as a repo man. Driving a beat-up 1953 Chevy pickup through rural Washington, recovering TVs and VCRs from people who hadn't paid their bills. Carrying an aluminum bat and a stolen .22 pistol with the trigger filed to the right. In rural Washington, violence was a second language, and Mark was fluent. One night, he had to drop something off at the Connor family house. Gary's wife insisted he stay for dinner. That's when he heard it, coming from somewhere deep in the house, a furious voice. "What? Leave me alone! For fuck's sake, I'm busy!" That was Lee Connor, Van's older brother. Mark had seen him around, but they'd never spoken. Lee appeared in the kitchen, stomping hard, not making eye contact. "Come on, then." Mark followed him to his bedroom. The room was pure psychedelia. Tapestries on purple and green walls, Grateful Dead posters, a 4-track Tascam cassette recorder sitting in the middle of it all. Lee had somewhere between 50 and 70 original songs. He played Mark 1. Fast, heavy, raw guitar. Surprisingly catchy. The lyrics were terrible. Butterflies and rainbows and the kind of earnest nonsense that made Mark's skin crawl. But the hooks were real. The guy could write a melody, and he'd built all of it alone, in this room, in a town where nobody even knew who Jimi Hendrix was. "Jesus Christ," Mark said. He spent hours in that room listening. Van and their friend Mark Pickerel wanted Lee out of the band. Mark disagreed. "You're insane for pushing him out. He's the only one here making original music. I'll play with you, but only if Lee stays and only if we play his songs." Van had no answer. "Fine. My mom's going to lose her mind when she finds out we kicked Lee out anyway. You sing, I play bass, Picks on drums. Deal." They took the name from an old electro-harmonics guitar pedal, the Screaming Tree, a treble booster. The irony being that Lee already had the thinnest, most trebly guitar tone imaginable. The Screaming Trees were born. Mark hated Ellensburg with every fiber of his being. He'd tried the National Guard, a traveling circus, got fired for refusing to cut his hair, manual labor, petty crime. Every door closed, every escape route blocked. But if this band could get him out of here, if it could give him the life he wanted, the excitement, the adventure, the world he'd read about in William Burroughs and Anais Nin, then it was worth any indignity, any difficulty, any torture. He would find out soon enough just how much that promise would cost him. Act 4. Fragile Kingdom. 6 months after their first rehearsal, the Screaming Trees were already in the studio. The recordings were raw, noisy, imperfect, but live, they were something else entirely. The moment Lee Connor stepped on a stage, he became a force of nature. Guitar spinning overhead, running wild, completely unhinged. Nobody in the Pacific Northwest was putting on a show like that. Word spread fast. Their drummer, Mark Pickerel, managed to put their demo tape directly into the hands of Greg Ginn, guitarist of Black Flag and founder of SST Records. Then, one day, working his shift at the electronics store, Mark picked up the phone. "Is this Mark Lanegan?" "Greg Ginn, SST Records." The Screaming Trees became the first band from Washington State to sign with them. A gang of misfits from a dusty cattle town suddenly had the credibility to walk into any room in the country. Ellensburg was finally behind them. But the Trees were a mess, fighting constantly, with each other, with promoters, with the music itself. Lee Connor was a force of nature on stage, but impossible off stage. 2 speeds, silent or furious. Then Van Connor, Mark's closest ally in the band, left to marry his 16-year-old pregnant girlfriend. They needed a bassist. Around that time, a friend asked Mark to check out a band playing at the Ellensburg Public Library. A small show, a tiny audience. Mark was living in a depressing 1-room apartment for $75 a week. No kitchen, 1 light bulb, a shared bathroom that was essentially a septic tank. He had nothing better to do. He almost didn't make it. He spent part of the evening guiltily watching his ex-girlfriend through her open window, tangled up with her new boyfriend in a fully lit room, then had to hide in the bushes from a passing police cruiser before finally slipping into the library right as the band was walking on stage. The bassist walked out, nearly 2 meters tall, ferocious energy, pissed off face before playing a single note. That's my bassist. The wall of sound hit him immediately. Raw, heavy, catchy as hell. One of the best bands he'd ever seen. In the middle of the Ellensburg Public Library. When the show ended, cut short after 3 or 4 songs by the city's curfew, the vocalist came to find him. "Hey man, I'm a huge fan of the Screaming Trees. Thanks for coming." Mark was caught off guard. This kid knew exactly who he was. They exchanged numbers on a show flyer with a ballpoint pen. Mark looked down at the name, Kurt. He walked back to his flophouse that night feeling electricity in his steps. He already had a plan to steal that bassist. Weeks later, the phone rang. "This is Chris Novoselic. I play bass in Nirvana. I can't take it anymore with Kurt. I'm done." Mark almost smiled. "I love your style. I'd be honored. But honestly, work it out with Kurt. You two have something special." He never told Kurt about the call. They became close friends. Long phone calls about music, girls, life. Mark loved Kurt and envied him because Nirvana was already fully formed the very first time he saw them. Great songs, great vocalist, great everything. Later, at a Nirvana show in Seattle, the Sub Pop founders, Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman, approached him before the show. They wanted to talk business. "When are the Trees going to leave SST and start making records for us?" "So you came for Blood Circus?" one of them asked. "No. Tad? I like Tad, but I'm here for Nirvana. They're the best band you have, by far. One of the best bands I've ever seen." The Sub Pop guys looked at each other. They hadn't seen it yet. Their own band, on their own label, and they hadn't seen it. Mark Lanegan was the first person to recognize that Nirvana was going to be something the world had never seen before. Before the labels understood it, before the press wrote about it, before anyone. Back in the Trees, the bassist problem was solved in the most unexpected way. They found Donna Dresch, a woman from a band they'd already played with. The moment she stepped on stage, everything changed. Cigarette hanging from the corner of her mouth, swinging the bass from side to side, hair flying. An unstoppable stage presence, like a female Keith Richards with twice the energy. For the first time, the Trees were genuinely dangerous live. Lee and Pickerel were threatened immediately. The audience's eyes were on Donna, not on Lee's guitar theatrics, and they knew it. Then Van came back. Marriage hadn't worked out. He wanted back in. Lee and Pix moved fast, voted Donna out behind Mark's back. 3 against 1. Mark was furious. "How the hell can Van vote for himself to come back? You never gave me or Donna a chance to vote. Fuck you all. Didn't you see how incredible we were with her?" He packed his few belongings into a storage unit, told the band, "If you want me as your singer, find me 100 miles to the west." He climbed on the back of a friend's motorcycle and headed to Seattle. Act 5. The Winding Sheet. Seattle changed everything. The city was alive with something electric. A scene forming in real time, bands crawling out of the rain and into history. Mark was in the middle of it, watching it happen from the inside, and through it all, there was Kurt. They'd spend afternoons at Kurt's place in Olympia listening to old blues records. Hours, no agenda, just music and silence and the kind of friendship that doesn't need to explain itself. One of those afternoons, an idea surfaced. We should record a Leadbelly covers album. Leadbelly, the legendary folk blues musician, ex-convict, 12-string guitar player. They got into the studio with Chris Novoselic on bass, but creating together turned out to be harder than being friends. The mutual respect paradoxically made them both unwilling to take the lead. The Leadbelly album never happened. But something else did. Jonathan Poneman from Sub Pop offered Mark a solo deal, $13,000. Mark had never played an instrument in his life. He bought a cheap used guitar and a Mel Bay chord book, built melodies in his head on the bus to work, came home and found the 3 or 4 chords that fit. Primitive, idiosyncratic, entirely his own. He called the album The Winding Sheet. Kurt appeared in the studio and played guitar and sang backing vocals on Down in the Dark, 2 friends who understood darkness in the same language. Spin magazine gave it a glowing review. Mark refused to do a single interview, refused to tour. He didn't know his own size. Back in the trees, the Epic deal came through, largely because the Nirvana explosion had made every label desperate to sign anything from Seattle. They recorded Uncle Anesthesia with producer Terry Date and Chris Cornell as co-producer. Cornell was a loner with a dark sense of humor, ferociously competitive, one of the most talented singers Mark had ever heard. They became close. The album sounded better than anything the Trees had done before. Epic had no idea what to do with it. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Lee Connor, the self-appointed dictator of the Screaming Trees, the man who had controlled every lyric, every arrangement, every creative decision for years, finally loosened his grip. Mark, you're a great singer, and we're going nowhere without you. I promise we'll build this next record together. The lyrics will be in your hands. We start and finish the songs as a team. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged Mark's contribution. They brought in Barrett Martin on drums, a powerhouse influenced by jazz and John Bonham, a revelation. They recorded Sweet Oblivion in New York with producer Don Fleming and engineer John Agnello, mixed by Andy Wallace, the same man who had mixed Nevermind. During the sessions, Mark had quietly started using heroin, snorting powder on the Lower East Side away from the band. He couldn't inject, no syringes available legally in New York, so he snorted. And he understood immediately why people never stopped. No blackouts, no bar fights, no waking up in jail with his face stuck to a blood-soaked pillow. Heroin quieted the mind that never stopped screaming. He could write, he could function, he could almost pass for normal. It felt like a solution. It was the beginning of the end. Van gave Mark a cassette he'd recorded alone in his garage during an acid trip, mostly inaudible noise. But buried in the tape, barely 1 minute long, was a riff. Simple, hypnotic. Van's drugged voice repeating, "I nearly lost you," in the distance. Mark rewound it 20 times. "Van, you don't know it yet, but you wrote a hit." Then came the call from their A&R man Bob Pfeiffer. Agitated, urgent. Sony was releasing the singles soundtrack. Every Seattle band, except the Trees. Mark walked to the hotel where Pearl Jam's Michael Goldstone was staying and delivered the tape personally, furious at having to beg for something that should have been theirs automatically. Goldstone listened, laughed at Mark's brutal honesty, shook his hand. "If someone's trying to keep you off this, I won't let it happen." Nearly Lost You made the soundtrack. It became a hit. MTV, radio, everywhere. For one brief moment, the Screaming Trees were exactly where they deserved to be. Meanwhile, Mark was in a hotel room in Seattle with Kurt when Nevermind dropped. Kurt was on the phone arguing about money. He got angry, slammed the receiver, ripped the cord from the wall, and screamed. Then the Smells Like Teen Spirit video came on MTV. 3 floors below, a car passed playing the song on the radio. Kurt looked destroyed, buried his face in the pillow. "It's not possible," he muttered. Mark watched his friend disappear into a fame neither of them had been built to survive. Sweet Oblivion dropped in the fall of 1992, 2 months after the single's soundtrack. Nearly Lost You became their only song to chart, the only video they ever had in regular rotation on MTV. It should have been a triumph. It wasn't. The Trees had essentially donated a hit single to a soundtrack they helped sell without receiving a single cent in return. Only later Mark discovered the truth. Every other band on that soundtrack had been paid. Mudhoney had received $20,000 for their song alone. The Trees got nothing. 300,000 copies sold, below the gold record threshold, and they had burned their best shot at the mainstream, fueling someone else's fire. The film itself? Mark never watched it. He saw the poster, actor Matt Dillon in a terrible wig plastered all over the city, and that was enough. Years later, drunk after a show in New York, he stubbed his lit cigarette into the pocket of Matt Dillon's suit jacket as the actor stood with his back turned. The jacket caught fire. Mark walked away. Some scores settle themselves. Act 6. House of Pain. November 1992. The Screaming Trees were on the road, sandwiched in a lineup between Grun Truck opening and Alice in Chains closing. 2 months across America. Offstage, it was a different kind of show entirely. Mark and Lane Staley found each other immediately. 2 singers, 2 wrecking balls, 2 men who had been using the same darkness as fuel for years and recognized it instantly in each other. They stayed up for days, shared whatever came their way, heroin, cocaine, painkillers, anything. One night, Alice in Chains bassist Mike Starr pulled them aside. "This girl gave me something. She said you guys might want it." He pulled out a large bottle from his jacket. "She said it's called Dilaudid." Mark and Lane reached for it at the same time, both trying not to look too eager. "Thanks, Mike. I think we can figure out something to do with this." They spent days injecting Dilaudid in pure, intoxicated bliss. When it ran out, they drank furiously until they could find opiates again. One night on the Alice bus, they got so out of control they destroyed the lounge area at the back of the vehicle. Susan Silver, their shared manager, came down hard on both of them the next morning. Mark was banned from the Alice in Chains bus, but it was on that same stage where Mark witnessed something that stopped him cold. Alice in Chains Live was like a heavy apocalyptic machine. Regardless of how wrecked Lane was, and he was always wrecked, he killed every night. Jerry Cantrell built the architecture of their sound, but Lane was the one who inhabited it. Powerful harmonies, impossible nuances, a voice so devastatingly raw it hit you physically standing at the side of the stage. After 24 hours awake, after days of shared destruction, Lane Staley would walk out and roar. In Mark's mind, Lane belonged in the same category as Rob Halford, Brian Johnson, Freddie Mercury, the most singularly impressive hard rock vocalist he would ever hear. Then came Philadelphia, November 25th, Mark's birthday. To celebrate, he and Lane went back to the hotel and got as high as they could. They ran into the guys from House of Pain, whose single Jump Around was everywhere at the time. Everlast invited them to party. Before joining, Mark shot up a powerful white powder heroin from the East Coast. He could barely lift his head from his chest. "He's fine," Lane told Everlast. "He just smoked some incredible weed." 2 days later, on the bus to Montreal, Mark noticed a stiffness and burning in his forearm, where he'd injected in Philadelphia. By the time they arrived in Quebec, his entire arm had doubled in size. Red, burning, a swollen apple. The doctor at the clinic took one look and sent him straight to the hospital. "You have a blood infection. You'll be lucky not to lose that arm." They drew a line around the inflammation from his shoulder to his wrist with a ballpoint pen. "I'll be back in 12 hours. If the redness crosses the line, we amputate at the shoulder." That night, Lane Staley took the stage with the Screaming Trees to sing in Mark's absence. Then he came to the hospital. He collapsed in tears at the sight of Mark lying in that corridor, arm enormous, red and swollen, hooked to an IV. 1 minute of uncontrollable crying. Then he pulled himself together. That was Lane, the same man who could destroy himself without blinking, breaking down at a hospital bed for his friend.
back when you learned that Lane Staley, the singer of Alice in Chains, sang Nearly Lost You with your band?
I thought that was nice. Lane's a good friend of mine, so it wasn't that surprising to me. And he came down after he sang and told me that he did that. I thought it was funny.
Early 1993. Back on the road, this time in Europe, opening for Alice in Chains again. The chemistry between Mark and Lane had only deepened. Two men running on the same fuel, living the same contradiction, destroying themselves offstage and delivering everything on stage. Then came Oslo. During a show, a large, aggressive man forced his way through the crowd, shoving people aside, knocking girls out of the way, determined to get to the front. Once there, having left injured people in his wake, he started screaming at Lane in Norwegian. Lane stopped the show. He calmly reached out, grabbed the Neanderthal by the arm, and invited him up on stage so he could share whatever was so important with the rest of the audience. The moment the man climbed up, he started bouncing around like a deranged version of Muhammad Ali. Mark watched from the side of the stage, ready to move if things got out of hand. They didn't. When the giant turned toward Lane, he was met with one precise, vicious punch directly to the face, sending him flying off the makeshift podium and back into the packed crowd. Lane Staley, winner by knockout. The audience roared. Security dragged the bloodied antagonist out of the club. The next morning, Oslo police arrived at the hotel, arrested Lane, confiscated his passport, and charged him with assault. Their British tour manager, Kevin Wilkins, a former amateur boxer from Birmingham who had seen everything and feared nothing, went to the station and eventually secured Lane's release. The tour continued. Mark flew home at the end of it, in withdrawal and completely exhausted. Back in Seattle, the addiction had taken over completely. Mark was a caged animal, and heroin was the cheese that kept him circling the trap. Every day the same loop. Find it, use it, find money for more. Broke constantly, maintaining a pathetic facade of sobriety for his girlfriend while she had long since seen through it. While he looked for escape in the needle, she looked for escape from him. Spring 1993. The Trees headlining their own U.S. tour for the first time. Their drum tech, John Hicks, had one official job title, but his real primary responsibility was sourcing drugs when Mark couldn't hit the streets himself. A dealer in Seattle named Tommy Hansen shipped heroin via FedEx several times a week. The martyrdom of waiting in hotel lobbies, pretending not to be watching for a package, acting outraged when it arrived. The machine ran on desperation. He could hear sirens in the distance through the open window. This is the end of my career, and the end of this idiot's life. Then Dave's eye moved. Mark threw another tray of water over his head, just as Peter Mensch knocked on the door. Mark, everything okay in there? He got Dave's bandmates to drag him out the side door just as the ambulance arrived. Everyone denied making the call, said it must have been a prank. Dave survived. It wasn't the first or last time Mark brought someone back, but it was the last time he ever traded his black tar heroin for someone else's killer drug. 2 appearances, 2 disasters. October 16th, 1992. The Screaming Trees' first appearance on national television, Late Night with David Letterman. The night before, in Asbury Park, New Jersey, the band had gotten into a full-blown bar brawl outside a club. Punches were thrown. Barrett Martin dislocated his shoulder and couldn't play the next night. Mark walked away with a black eye. When they got to the studio, he refused to let the makeup artists touch his face. He went on national TV looking exactly like what he was. Paul Schaefer was visibly enthusiastic about the heavy rock sound filling the studio. Letterman was impressed enough to call the band back out at the end of the show. The Connor brothers attacked the catering. Mark started a food fight and accidentally hit Letterman with the debris. He was banned from the show for 17 years. Spring 1993. Jay Leno hosting The Tonight Show. The night before the taping, Mark got high in his West Hollywood hotel room. Couldn't sleep. Took a bigger dose. Fell asleep past 3 a.m., head hanging off the edge of the bed. Stomach acid traveled up his throat and into his lungs. He woke up with his chest on fire. For 2 hours, he stood over the sink, coughing, spitting, trying to clear his airways. Tears streaming, sweat pouring. He put his head under the tap. It made it worse. The wake-up call came anyway. He went down to the lobby looking like a survivor. Their guitar tech, Danny Baird, took one look at him and froze. "Jesus Christ, Lanegan, what did you do last night?" Don't ask. The producers wanted the band there from morning until midnight, a full day of hurry up and wait. Endless camera angles, endless sound checks, his voice deteriorating by the hour. At some point between the 8th and 10th take of a song he hadn't planned to sing, Mark retreated to a corner of the dressing room, wrapped himself in a heavy corduroy coat he'd bought for £10 at a Glasgow thrift shop, and lay down on the floor. He'd been fighting off a panic attack since the car ride over, the first one he'd felt coming since the early 1980s. The burning in his lungs wouldn't let him take a full breath without pain. The Klonopin he'd taken wasn't helping. Then, at the last minute, the producers switched the song. Not Nearly Lost You. They wanted Dollar Bill, the current single. A song nobody on the production had ever heard. A song demanding more vocal nuance than he had left in his body. He was furious. When they finally walked on stage, the PA sounded like a karaoke bar. A transparent plastic tank surrounded Barrett's entire drum kit, standard for television, meant to contain the volume. The whole setup was a facade, a magic trick. The burning in his chest hadn't let up for a second. Sweat poured into his eyes so badly he couldn't keep them open for most of the performance. He fought through 3.5 minutes knowing, with complete clarity, that he sounded terrible. His voice a rough caricature of itself, his effort to stay in tune visible to anyone watching. When it was over, he headed straight for the exit. A producer caught him by the arm. "Jay wants you on the couch for the sign-off." He sat down next to James Garner, an actor he'd loved since childhood for his role as private detective Jim Rockford in the Rockford Files. Leno looked over and winked like a used car salesman. "That was okay, right? Sell some records?" Garner reached over, took his hand in a firm grip. "How are you, son? That wasn't bad at all. Could have been a lot worse." With that generous benediction, his humiliation was complete. Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. He went back to work on his second solo album for Sub Pop. The combination of heroin and obsession drove him into a tunnel he couldn't find his way out of. He cycled through producers, Terry Date, Jack Endino, rewriting, re-recording, remixing, re-sequencing the same songs over and over. Sleeping on the control room couch, shooting up in the bathroom just to function. He hadn't eaten in days, hadn't showered in weeks. One afternoon at Bear Creek Studio in Woodinville, he snapped. He gathered every reel of analog tape, 2 years of work, and walked out the back door toward the creek. Jack Endino ran after him. "Lanegan, stop! What the hell are you doing?" "Fuck this record. I'm drowning it." Endino physically blocked his path. "There's a beautiful album in there, and I'm not letting you destroy it. Get back inside." Mark stood there, arms full of tape canisters, chest heaving. Then the exhaustion hit all at once. He went back inside, fell asleep on the couch. Woke up hours later to Endino shaking him by the shoulder. "Found it. The kick drum track was buried on an unlabeled reel. That's what you were hearing." The album he'd been chasing for 2 years had been there the whole time. To finish it, engineer John Agnello brought him to New York. November. A studio near Times Square. Cheap, weird, walls lined floor to ceiling with cookie jars in every shape imaginable. Every morning, Mark would walk down to the Lower East Side to score, then make it back in time to not piss off Agnello, who was funny as hell until you interrupted his work. Jay Mascis came in to lay down some drum overdubs. One afternoon, while Agnello was mixing The River Rise, the song meant to open the album, Jay picked up a rudimentary synthesizer and conjured something that sounded like wind blowing through an alley. Then he found a cookie jar shaped like a beggar leaning against a lamppost. When you lifted the lid, it... "That's it," Jay said. "The wind and the whistle. You have to put this on the record." "Can you two please shut up? I'm actually trying to work here," said Agnello. "But John, it's genius. Can't you hear it?" Agnello threw them both out of the studio. They talked him back in. The album opens with Jay's synthesized wind and the whistling cookie jar beggar. Mark decided that was strangely appropriate. A few weeks later, Agnello pulled him into a bear hug. "See, idiot? I told you we'd get there." 3 years, 1,000 wrong turns, an album he'd tried to drown in a creek. Done. Back in Seattle, he handed Kurt Cobain a cassette copy of Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. Kurt called a few days later. "This is really incredible, man. The best thing you've ever done. Not crazy about the title, but it's a classic album. Congratulations, brother." A month after finishing the album, the phone rang. A stranger, a filmmaker, he said. Sally Berry had left Mark's cassette playing at his apartment. He'd heard the whole record and needed to talk. "I want to use your album as the entire soundtrack for my first film." His name was David O. Russell. The film was called Spanking the Monkey. Russell talked fast, passionate, direct, slightly overwhelming. He'd already written the screenplay, a coming-of-age story, a college student stuck at home for the summer caring for his mother who has a broken leg. He was hoping to get Faye Dunaway to play the mother. He wanted Mark to come to Massachusetts during filming, sit with him, help sequence the songs so the music would breathe with the story. Mark read the script the next day, FedExed overnight. He had no experience reading screenplays and found it difficult to follow at first. Then he got to a scene where the son and the mother end up sleeping together. He put the script down. "I tried to picture Faye Dunaway as the mother and realized that when she played Joan Crawford, she reminded me of my own mother." The thought made him sick. He also had no interest in leaving Seattle. Leaving meant finding a new source. Answering the phone meant having to explain himself. So he behaved, as he later put it, like a self-centered child, never picked up, never responded, never gave Russell the courtesy of a single call back. The film came out in 1994 to strong reviews. For the soundtrack, Russell turned to Morphine, the Massachusetts trio built around baritone saxophone, slide bass, and drums. Low rock, no guitars. One of the most singular sounds in American music, fronted by the late, irreplaceable Mark Sandman. The film launched them to a whole new audience. Over the years that followed, Mark watched David O. Russell become one of the most celebrated directors in Hollywood. Award seasons, A-list casts, the whole machinery of prestige cinema turning in his favor. "I lost what could have been a life-changing experience," he wrote. Not that it made any difference to him. He already had plans B, C, and D. But that was the addiction in charge. David O. Russell was only one of the doors that closed that way. There were others. Most of them Mark never even saw closing. "It was my habit to avoid answering the phone when I wanted to hide from something that would come to haunt me. Not about this, but something far more personal, with far more devastating results. Something was coming. He just wasn't ready to hear it yet." Kurt Cobain, November 1993. Kurt called with an idea. He wanted Mark to perform Where Did You Sleep Last Night with Nirvana for their MTV Unplugged taping. The Lead Belly song they'd once planned to record together, the one Mark had used on the winding sheet. Mark declined. It felt strange, a relatively unknown singer appearing alongside the biggest band in the world on one of the most watched music shows on television. It felt like charity. "Okay, then I'll sing it," Kurt said. "Exactly the way you did, brother. If that's all right with you." "Sing it however you want. It's not my song." "I only sang it the way I did because of how you played guitar." They met for lunch a few days later at a bar in Capitol Hill. Kurt had asked Mark to score some heroin on the way over, which he did. In the dim, mid-afternoon light of the bar, nobody recognized them. They drank Cokes, ate half their sandwiches. On the way back, Kurt stopped at an ATM. Mark watched him withdraw several $1,000s from multiple accounts, pocketing some hundreds, then turning and handing Mark a thick stack of 20s. "You need me to score again?" Mark asked, confused. He'd just delivered. "No, brother, this is for you." "What? I can't take all this. Are you crazy?" "I love you, and you need it. That's it. Lanegan, please." He stopped arguing, watched Kurt get into a cab that disappeared up Cherry Street. At home, he counted it. Just over $300. He felt the shame immediately. Their friendship had started in pure mutual admiration. Two people who heard something in each other's music that most people missed. But somewhere along the way, it had curdled into something else. Instead of being a positive force in this man's life, Mark had become a conduit for his destruction. "I was a parasite living off the misery of someone I'd loved for years," he wrote. An actively negative presence in the life of this beautiful, talented man who, instead of showing any positive direction, kept taking the lowest road just so I could stay high. He knew it, and knowing it made it worse. A few weeks later, past midnight, the phone rang. Kurt. Incoherent, barely audible, 3/4 of what he was saying lost to whatever was in his system. The only thing that came through clearly was that he needed Mark there, now. Mark and John Hicks grabbed a cab, 15 minutes to Kurt's lakeside property. They knocked. No answer. Mark circled the perimeter until he found a window without blinds. Kurt was face down on the floor. "Hicks, find a way in." Hicks ran the perimeter, checking every door and window. Mark pounded on the massive floor-to-ceiling glass, 6 feet wide, screaming Kurt's name. Nothing. Then, a hand moved. "He's moving. He's not dead. Get a rock!" Hicks appeared a minute later, carrying a boulder Mark could barely believe he'd lifted. Before they could use it, Kurt, eyes completely shut, moving on what seemed like pure animal instinct, began the agonizing crawl toward the door, an inch at a time. Nearly 2 hours of coaxing, screaming, begging. At one point, he made it to his feet, took a few steps, and his ankle twisted so badly Mark was certain it had snapped. Finally, he reached the door and got it unlocked. They carried him to the couch. John soaked a towel in ice water and held it to the back of his neck. They stayed through the night, watching his breathing, keeping him warm. In the morning, Kurt remembered almost nothing. "Just a shot of heroin. Nothing unusual," he said. "No pills, no alcohol." Mark sat with the guilt of it in silence. He was the one who'd supplied him. He knew Kurt's body couldn't handle what his could. He knew the weight difference, the stomach problems, the physical fragility underneath the noise. "I was not just an enabler. I was something much worse." When those thoughts arrived, they brought with them a ruthless self-contempt he had no defense against. He just kept using anyway. Dark days. Early April 1994. Mark was lying on his cigarette-burned couch in a dirty robe, watching television with the sound off, chain-smoking, when the phone rang. He let the machine pick up. "Hey man, it's Kurt. I'm back in town. Come over, let's listen to records." He thought about it for a minute. He was low on money, but high on drugs. Going out to score for Kurt felt like work. And Courtney would probably be there. Every time he'd been to their house in recent months, she'd be warm and friendly with him until something ignited between them, and Mark ended up caught in the middle of a domestic war he wanted no part of. He didn't go. Kurt called twice more that afternoon. Mark didn't pick up. He lay there in the silence, staring at the muted screen, dimly aware that something was forming at the edges of the day. He ignored it. Late afternoon, the shared entertainment lawyer Rosemary Carroll left a message. "Mark, if you know where Kurt is, I need you to tell me right now." Then another. "If he's at your apartment and you're not telling me, we have a problem." He called her back. "Mark, I don't think you understand what's happening. He walked out of a rehab clinic yesterday, flew back to Seattle, and now nobody can reach him." He didn't know about the overdose weeks earlier, publicly ruled accidental, later understood by those close to him as a suicide attempt. He didn't know Kurt had been in rehab at all. He didn't know that the day he called, the day Mark lay on the couch and let the phone ring, was the day Kurt came home. He called Kurt's number. No answer. He called every mutual friend he could think of. Nothing. How could I have known? How could I have known? The next day, someone from the Nirvana camp asked Mark to go with Dylan Carlson to check the places Kurt might be. A private detective named Tom Grant, hired by Courtney, picked them up. They drove from dealer to dealer, bar to bar, every spot Kurt was known to go. Nothing. Eventually, Grant drove them to Kurt's lakeside property. They went room to room, calling his name. No answer. Mark stepped outside to smoke. He found himself standing under a staircase that led up to a small room above the garage. For a moment, just a moment, he thought about going up. Dylan and Grant appeared, ready to leave. Mark stubbed out his cigarette and put the half-smoked remainder in his jacket pocket. They got in the car. 1 or 2 days later, Rosemary called again. She was barely able to speak. Kurt's body had been found in the room above the garage, the small room above the staircase where Mark had been standing. The coroner determined he had died the same day they were there searching for him. Mark hung up the phone. He sat down on the floor, put his hands over his face, and came apart completely. Tears of remorse, self-hatred, a grief so enormous he knew immediately it would never fully leave him. I knew I would never get over his death. It would be a shadow over me until the day I died. The days that followed were a blur. Everett True, a British journalist Mark had once drunkenly knocked off a bar stool at the 1992 Reading Festival, the only time Kurt had ever looked at him with open fury and said quietly, "You imbecile," came to Seattle at Courtney's request and stayed with Mark through the week before the memorial. They barely spoke. They sat together in the shocked silence of people who had no adequate language for what had happened and shared what they had. Memories of a man neither of them had been able to save. At the memorial near the Space Needle, Mark sat in a state of disassociation, unable to process a single word being said. He was drowning in the deepest shame and self-contempt of his life. At the private wake afterward, Courtney pulled him into a fierce embrace and began to cry. Every eye in the room turned to them. Mark used every reserve of will he had not to break down with her. He left as soon as he could. On his way out the door, Kristen Pfaff, the dark-haired bassist of Hole, was coming in. They'd met only a few times. She looked at him and smiled in a way that stopped him cold. Something passed between them. He got in a cab and held on to that smile all the way home and deep into the night. The first thought that hadn't been about death in weeks. Weeks later, his friend Lori Barbero called from Minneapolis. "Hey, someone wants to talk to you." A young woman's voice. "Mark?" "Yeah?" "Do you know who this is?" "I have no idea," he said honestly. "It's Kristen, from Hole. What are you doing right now?" She was direct. She wanted to see him. She'd be back in Seattle in June. He laughed, his first real laugh in weeks. "That sounds like an excellent idea." He hung up, smiling like an idiot. Weeks later, Courtney called. Sobbing, barely coherent. "Kristen overdosed. She died in a bathtub. Her first night back in Seattle." Mark sat down on the floor, hands on his head, eyes on the wall. Life was a completely cruel and savage beast. Everything and everyone around me was cursed. The conspiracy theories started almost immediately. Courtney was being crucified in every magazine and television program that would have her, blamed for Kurt's unhappiness, blamed for his death, blamed for existing. She didn't make it easy. She was the loudest person in any room, a public figure who refused to be invisible, and that made her an easy target. Then came the darker rumors, that it wasn't a suicide, that she and Dylan had conspired to kill him, that the shotgun was evidence, that the note was forged. Mark had watched Dylan convince Kurt to buy that shotgun. He knew exactly how it happened. Not conspiracy, not murder. Kurt wanted protection, and Dylan did what Dylan always did for him, what Mark had done too, the same errand any of them ran, because fame had turned the simplest tasks into a spectacle Kurt couldn't face alone. The insane theories suggesting Courtney and Dylan had conspired to murder Kurt were complete nonsense, he said flatly. But with her manic energy, she sometimes pushed everyone around her to their absolute limit. Dylan himself had put it plainly at the time. If anyone had been sent to get rid of the other, it would have been Kurt asking someone to get rid of Courtney. Mark believed that too. What he knew, what nobody wanted to hear, was simpler and more devastating than any conspiracy. Kurt was a physically fragile man with an undiagnosed chronic pain condition that made eating an act of endurance, a man with a body that processed heroin differently than most, who lived surrounded by people who supplied him without ever stopping to consider the weight difference, the stomach, the Constitution, who was famous in a way that had become a prison, who had tried to die before and succeeded the second time. That was the truth, not a murder mystery, just a man who had been in tremendous pain for a very long time, surrounded by people who loved him and failed him simultaneously, Mark included, especially Mark. Without Kurt, Mark fell off the edge of the world. Broke and alone, he started selling crack outside his building to Eritrean and Ethiopian street people, spending everything on heroin. He couldn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time, too terrified to lie down, convinced that if he did, he'd never wake up. He sat upright in a wooden chair next to a leaking radiator, jolted awake by seagulls screaming outside the window. His feet were rotting, the nerves dying. Every accidental bump against a wall sent pain shooting through his body like electricity. Courtney called constantly, for company, for drugs, for someone to absorb the weight of her grief. She told him Kurt had been obsessed with whiskey for the Holy Ghost in his final weeks, had played it on repeat, alone, before the end. Mark had already lied to a Rolling Stone reporter, saying they hadn't spoken in weeks before the death. He'd never told anyone about the unanswered calls. He carried it in silence. When Courtney's calls became unsustainable, swinging between seduction and violence, warmth and fury, hour after hour, he made a decision. He was done. He unplugged the answering machine, lit some incense, put on Seven Samurai with the sound off, and passed out on the couch. He was woken by voices in the hallway. His landlord, Christian, a man he despised and who despised him back, was at the door. And with him, unmistakably, Courtney's voice. "I'm very worried about him. He was supposed to come by today." Mark stood up in the dark, tiptoed to the door, picked up the aluminum baseball bat he kept beside it, already bent from previous use. The landlord offered to let her in for a look around. Mark raised the bat, flexed his knees, tensed his shoulders, ready. Well, I'm sure he's fine. Better not invade his privacy. And just like that, they were gone. He stood there in the dark for a long time, bat in hand, cold sweat on his neck. He ran into her a few weeks later, told her he'd been out of town for a family emergency. By then she had new people around her, new interests. She rarely included him again. He was free, but free inside a life that was still killing him. Kurt was gone. Kristen was gone. The darkness he'd spent years using heroin to silence was louder than ever. And the only answer he had was the same one that had started all of this. Kurt Cobain was gone. Lane Staley was disappearing. Mark Lanegan had stood closer to the fire than almost anyone, close enough to feel it, close enough to have pulled them back. He didn't. What comes next is the story of what happens when the last man standing is also trying to fall. Part 2, May 31st,